The officer didn't raise his voice, he just punched the 16-year-old black boy in the face, right in front of the judge. The courtroom froze. The boy did not cry, he did not scream. She wiped the blood from her lip, looked toward the door, because her father had just walked through the door. And suddenly, everything changed. What would you do if someone slapped your child right there in court? This father did not scream. He didn't threaten. He just walked in and changed everything without saying a word. Comment below, because sometimes silence is the strongest response. You could feel it the moment you walked into that courtroom. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of eyes that had already decided. They looked before he even sat down. A 16-year-old black boy, his wrist in handcuffs, entered flanked by 2 bailiffs. Not a word from him, not a tear, just quiet footsteps on a polished floor that suddenly felt too loud. Someone behind me whispered, "He must have done something wrong." And so he was guilty for the court. Officer Doyle took the stand as if he had done it 100 times, calm, confident. He didn't look at the boy, he didn't need to. He had the plaque, the stage behind him, the wind in his favor. He put it mildly. He resisted. He became insolent. I had to restrain him, as if I were reading a weather report. The judge nodded. He barely looked up. That assent, that was the real sentence. I could feel the air getting heavier. The boy just sat there, still, not stiff, not scared, just as if he had done this before. Her hands rested in her lap, eyes focused, unblinking. He looked at Doyle, and for a moment, just a flicker, tilted his head. Then he asked in a low voice, "Is this your idea of the law?" No threat, no attitude, just a question. But it fell like a slap in the face. Doyle froze for half a second, then stepped down from the bench 1 step, then 2, and right there in front of the judge, without warning, slapped the boy across the face. You could hear it with a rippling motion, a gasp, a stifled scream, but no one moved, not the bailiff or the judge, just silence. The boy didn't cry, he didn't raise his voice. He slowly raised his hand, wiped the blood from his lip, and smiled. Then she looked Doyle in the eye, firm and unwavering, and said, "You just made a mistake you'll regret forever." Not loud, but it sounded louder than any gavel in that courtroom. The slap had landed, but the boy didn't crumble. He didn't even react the way people expected. No tears, no screaming, just a stillness of the kind that unnerves a courtroom, as if it knew this wasn't the worst of it. They called a recess. People murmured, shifted. The judge left without a glance, and then the public defender was brought in. Nina Ford, not new to this building, not new to children being thrown into it, walked calmly, heels clicking softly against the tiles, and crouched down next to the boy, careful not to overwhelm him. "I'm Nina. I've been asked to represent you. May I have your name?" He looked sideways, slow, measured, and for the first time since he'd walked in, spoke. Names mean nothing here. Inside. There was no attitude in his voice, no challenge, just experience, like someone who had seen this place chew over names before. Nina studied him. He didn't seem scared or even angry, just heavy, like something was sitting on him that no one else could see. "Still," she said gently, "I'd like to know what to call you." A pause, then a breath. Jane Carter." She wrote it down, reviewed it in her notes, no criminal record, no red flags. But that only made her more curious, because something about this guy didn't match the paperwork. He wasn't restless, he wasn't defensive. Her body didn't speak of fear, it spoke of control, the kind you re-taught, not born with. It was then that he noticed it, a thin silver chain tucked under the collar of his shirt. Not flashy, not for show, just something she carried close, almost as if it wasn't for anyone else to see. Nina didn't want to look, but she caught the light as he settled into his seat. So she leaned slightly, and her eyes caught the engraving. Carter Field Office. FBI. His breathing stopped. He didn't say anything. Not yet, he just looked at him again. He saw it in her eyes. He knew she had read it, and without a word he reached up, tucked the chain back into his shirt, and turned away. "I'm not hiding. I just finished explaining." "Whatever you think that means," he said quietly, "it doesn't change how you see me in here." That was the moment she realized he wasn't trying to win this case. He was just trying to survive it. They say a court recess is a time to catch your breath, but for Jane, it was just the next round. The judge had retired. Most of the people dispersed in silent conversation, tapping phones, drinking coffee from paper cups. But the boy remained alone at the defense table, still handcuffed. It was then that two officers approached, not quickly, not loudly, just casually, as if they had done it a dozen times before. "We're doing a drug check," said one of them. "Sect. Protocol." Right there, in the middle of the courtroom, they abruptly opened his backpack, ripped open his notebooks, knocked out his pens, and opened every pocket, as if they were sure something was hidden. They even brought out a foil-wrapped sandwich, tossed it aside like trash, and he just sat there watching them tear apart the pieces of an already judged life. Nina stood up quickly. "He is not arrested for possession. They have no grounds to, but they cut off. Ma'am, we're doing our job. Can you file a complaint later?" Later, always later. That word was a brick wall thrown at you every time you tried to breathe. One of the officers scribbled something on a clipboard, tore off the sheet of paper, and threw it in with the mess. Suspicious behavior, filed, no drugs, no nothing, but still a mark. Jane didn't move, didn't protest. She walked over slowly and packed her things back into her backpack, one by one carefully, as if it were muscle memory. It was then that the second officer, a younger one, perhaps in his 30s, leaned toward his partner and muttered loud enough for all of us to hear. "Look at him, a future inmate, not a student." Time didn't stop, but hearts did. Even Nina froze and Jane. He just zipped the bag and kept his eyes down as if he knew this part by heart. Then Doyle returned, arms crossed, that same crooked smile, tossed a folded sheet of paper under the judge's bench and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to add resisting arrest and obstructing reporting." The defendant became uncooperative during transport. Simons barely looked at the paper, didn't ask a question, didn't ask the boy, just adjusted his glasses and clicked his pen. Annotated charges added to the file. It's that simple. And then he said it so calmly, so bureaucratically, as if he were adding tomato sauce to an order that was already coming. Sometimes you have to treat them like what they will become. The room didn't gasp this time because they weren't surprised, just disgusted. Nina clenched her jaw. The boy was unfazed, and I remember sitting there thinking that he wasn't just being judged. He was being told who he was allowed to become. By the time court resumed, Nina was ready. She had been silent during the last break, but anyone who watched her could see that something had changed. No fear, no panic, focus. He walked to the center of the courtroom with a USB drive in his hand the way a surgeon might hold a scalpel. There was no tremor, no great speech. "Your Honor," he began in a firm voice, "I have new recorded evidence from a civilian security camera at the corner of Darrow and Fifth." The judge raised an eyebrow, but did not speak. It shows the incident that Officer Doyle described and tells a very different story. He handed the memory to the clerk, who connected it to the court monitor. The screen flickered, then the footage played. It wasn't crystal clear, but it didn't have to be. There, in the grainy video, was Jane standing between Officer Doyle and an elderly black man who looked terrified and confused. The man had a cane. He moved slowly. He was saying something inaudible but pleading. Doyle pushed him hard. The man staggered back and Jane, just a boy, caught him. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't scream. He just stood between them, holding out both arms like a human shield. That was all. And at that moment I could feel the room stop breathing. Even some jurors leaned forward. It was clear, too clear. Nina looked at the judge. "This footage contradicts Officer Doyle's affidavit and shows that my client acted to prevent harm, not cause it." For a moment it felt like something had cracked, like maybe today would be different. But then Judge Simon leaned back, took off his glasses, wiped them, and said, without looking up, "I brought it, unverified, dismissed, without explanation, without pause." Just like that, the truth was filed away as irrelevant. You could hear it, that sound a courtroom makes when hope falls flat on the floor. Not a gasp, not a cry, just disappointment, like watching someone bury a body they're sworn to protect. Nina froze for half a second. But Doyle smiled wider than he'd smiled all morning. "It's always not their fault," he said, "until they're handcuffed." That was when Jane looked up for the first time since that slap. She lifted her head and spoke quietly, not for show, but with weight. "You're not the first to bury the truth, but I might be the last to stay buried." The words didn't echo, didn't need to, they just fell. And that was when the shifting in the seats began, the murmurs, the tightening in Jayan's chest. Every person who had ever seen someone like him pushed down and told to stay put. People weren't just watching anymore, they were feeling, they were angry. But the boy went quiet again, hands folded, eyes steady. And for the first time the courtroom wasn't judging him, it was watching. After the footage was dismissed, Nina sat back down, but she wouldn't let it go. She kept her eyes on Jalen, trying to read the silence he wore like a second skin. He hadn't looked angry, hadn't slouched, hadn't even blinked when the judge whisked the truth away like dust on a windowsill. But something had changed. She could feel it. Nina leaned toward him, not to push, just to let him know she was still there. That's when he slid a folded piece of paper toward her. No eye contact, no urgency. She opened it. One neatly written line. Observe. Don't act. Not yet. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a question. It was direction. And for a split second, she wasn't sure who was defending whom. Then she noticed the way he adjusted his sleeve. Slow, deliberate, revealing the watch beneath. At first glance, nothing unusual. Simple black band, metal clasp, digital face. But Nina had seen it before, exactly that model, issued by the office to relatives of agents working on volatile assignments. One touch could send a signal. 2 touches could send more. He said nothing. She just looked at him. And he didn't look back, just leaned back calmly, still, as if he knew exactly how much time was left on the clock. Somewhere in the back row, a man shifted in his seat, not loudly, not nervously. He sat in the corner, a few rows behind the press section. Dark suit, without a tie, upright, hands folded gently in front of him. His eyes never left Jayan once. Most wouldn't notice, but if you did, you'd notice something immediately. He wasn't watching out of concern. He was watching like someone waiting for confirmation. Marcus Carter had just entered history, but the room didn't know it yet, and the kid didn't look back. He didn't need to because silence when elected is louder than any outburst, and sometimes staying still is how you prepare to turn everything upside down. You could tell Doyle thought the courtroom was his again. He leaned back against the railing with that familiar smile of the guy who came from knowing no one would stop him. Not here, not now, not with that badge. The video had been discarded, the truth buried again, and the kid still sat there, still silent, still handcuffed. So Doyle did what men like him always do when they think the story's over. He sneered. "No one's here to save you, kid." He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. He said it with the kind of ease that meant he believed it. He believed it so deeply he didn't even look around first. And for a heartbeat, he was right. No one moved, not the judge, not the bailiff, not the crowd, until a chair scraped softly in the back. From the courtroom. You could barely hear him, but the silence made him loud. A man stood slowly, composed, wearing a dark suit, no tie, and a clean white shirt. The kind of presence that doesn't announce itself, but takes over the room by existing. He walked down the aisle, not hurried, not hesitant, as if he belonged there, as if he knew exactly where this path led. Some people turned, others looked, but the guy didn't move, not even a backward glance, because he knew, had known. The man reached the front row, paused, then stepped into the open space between the gallery and the bar, and in a firm but low voice, so low it made everyone lean in, said, "I do." Just 2 words, but they cut cleanly through the courtroom, like a sharp wind through glass. Doyle blinked, steeled himself, then straightened his shoulders, trying to hold on to whatever authority he thought he still had. But the man was already reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a case of leather plates, slow, intentional. He opened it. The gold gleamed in the courtroom lights, not loud, but final. Marcus Carter, Assistant Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The word struck like thunder muffled on velvet. No shouting, no drama, just truth presented clearly. There was a pause. Not in the sentence, but in the air, a deep silence stretched as if the room needed time to comprehend what it had just heard. Then it happened. A juror shifted, jaw clenched. A reporter dropped her pen. The court clerk looked up, confused, and the judge froze. Doyle didn't speak. His face said enough, because in that moment the balance tipped. Everything he'd built, the smiles, the power, the comfort, slipped away. Marcus didn't look at him yet. He turned his gaze, slow, deliberate, to Judge Simons, eyes steady, shoulders square, and then gently, with the weight of the law behind every syllable, "You silence my son." A pause. Not for effect, for clarity. Now you will hear the sound of responsibility. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't an act, it was an undeniable, unstoppable fact. Judge Simons didn't blink. He didn't breathe, just looked back, pale. Jayan turned slightly in his seat, still handcuffed, still at attention. He glanced over his shoulder, not surprised, not smug, and smiled. Just a slight curl of the lips, a moment of softness beneath all that silence. Then, barely loud enough for Nina to hear, he said, "I told you someone would notice." No one else spoke. No one dared, because, for the first time since the boy had walked into that courtroom, he was no longer the one being watched. The courtroom still swayed, but Marcus Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped forward slowly, each deliberate movement, not like a father pleading, but like a man who knew the weight of the law and how to use it. "Your Honor," he said calmly, eyes fixed on Simons, "I am formally requesting a special evidentiary hearing." There was a pause. He could feel it. Simons looked down at the witness stand, then back at Marcus, trying to maintain his composure. On what grounds? Marcus didn't blink. On grounds of prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias, and falsification of testimony by Officer Doyle. And just like that, the atmosphere changed. Nina stood, voice clear and precise. "Your Honor, we are submitting verified footage. It has been reviewed and authenticated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It confirms that my client, Jayan Carter, intervened to prevent excessive force from being used against an unarmed civilian." A hush fell over the room again as the screen lit up. Same video, but now with an official seal, time code, and FBI watermark. You could see Doyle in the corner of the frame, shoving the elderly man. Jayan intervening, protecting. There was no mistaking it. And when the video ended, Marcus turned, pulled out another folder, thicker, heavier, and handed it to the clerk. "These are internal affairs documents," he said. 3 separate incidents in the last 5 years involving Officer Doyle. Each marked by misconduct, each buried. He looked directly at Simons. All 3 cases were scheduled for judicial review. All 3 were dismissed in preliminary hearings by you. Simon stiffened. His hand hovered over his gavel, but he didn't bring it down. He couldn't, because this wasn't a courtroom anymore. No, this really was a reckoning. Marcus took a final step forward on the orders of federal authority. He said, louder now. "Firm. Officer Doyle, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and falsification of official records." Gasps. A flash of movement. 2 federal agents in suits appeared at the side door, entering into view like shadows called forward by the truth. Doyle tried to speak, mouth open, but no sound came out. The handcuffs were put on not quickly, not harshly, just finally, in front of everyone, in front of the judge, in front of the boy who thought he had no power. Simon froze, the color draining from his face. He looked at Marcus, then at Nina, then at Jylan, but didn't say a word. He didn't defend himself, he didn't apologize, he just looked down and said nothing at all. Because sometimes silence isn't power, sometimes it's surrender. The moment the handcuffs clicked, the phones went up silently at first, then all at once. The sound of video recordings filled the room like rain after a drought. Within minutes the footage was online. A shaky clip of Officer Doyle being arrested. Hands behind back, face pale as chalk. The title read, "Justice for Jayan." It started small, a few dozen retweets, a handful of TikToks, then it grew. By noon it was everywhere. News anchors replayed the moment. Facebook Live comments poured in. TikTok, duets, Twitter threads. Hashtags stacked on top of each other. Justice for Jayan. Rona's silence is power. Watch the courtroom fall. What happened inside that courtroom was no longer confined within 4 walls. It spilled into living rooms and fits and dinner tables. People weren't just seeing, they were remembering, they were recognizing. some with disbelief, others with pain, but most with a sense of something long overdue, finally being achieved. In the gallery, an older black woman stood up slowly. He hadn't spoken all day, but now, as the officers led Doyle away in handcuffs, he whispered under his breath. He didn't raise his voice, but his silence hit harder than any hammer. And he was right, because Jane didn't scream, didn't beg, she just waited. And when the truth came out, he found it as if he had been waiting for it all along. That clip of him smiling just before the arrest, that smile became a symbol, a screenshot, a movement. The FBI responded quickly. An internal review was announced. All judicial decisions made by Judge Simons in the last 5 years would be re-examined. The dominoes had begun to fall, not out of anger, but out of silence, finally being heard. And for once, justice didn't have to scream to be heard. The doors of the courthouse opened, and the world was waiting. Camera flashes, reporters leaning forward with microphones, a line of questions shouted one over the other, all blending into a kind of frantic noise. But Jayan didn't hurry. He walked slowly out to his father's side, blinking at the daylight, as if it didn't surprise him. Someone from the front, a young reporter, pushed her voice above the rest. "Why didn't you speak before?" Jayan stopped not to think, just to let the noise settle around the silence he was about to offer. Then he said softly, "Because when justice speaks for you, you don't need to shout." It wasn't a slogan, it wasn't a challenge. It was the kind of response that only comes from someone who has learned to listen to the weight of their own silence and found power in it. Marcus stood beside him, hands still, shoulders high. He looked at his son not as a deputy headmaster, not as a man of title or authority, only as a father who had missed too many moments that mattered. Then he spoke just loud enough for Jalen to hear. "I missed your childhood, but I won't miss your courage." Jalen didn't answer, just nodded once, and they walked with no hand on his shoulder, no arms linked, just two men, father and son, moving side by side, step by step, not toward a press conference, not toward a headline, but toward a different kind of story. Behind them, someone started clapping, then another, and soon the sound swelled, not like a stadium, but like respect. Rising from the waxworks. Warm, silent, proud. They didn't wave, they didn't stop, because this wasn't about the crowd. It was about each kid who'd been told to sit down. Every parent who thought they had waited too long. Every truth that had been buried beneath uniforms and silence, and was now walking free. They silenced a boy, but they woke up a generation. If this story moved you even a little, then maybe it's because deep down we all want to believe that silence can still speak volumes, and that dignity can still change the room. Jane didn't fight with noise. She stood with purpose, and in doing so she remembered us. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it comes in silently and stands tall. If you believe in stories that matter, stories that reflect courage, truth, and quiet power, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories for more stories that speak to the heart. Your support means everything to us. Every view, every comment, every share fuels the work we do and reminds us why we do it. Because here at Mr. Mac Stories, we don't just tell stories, we tell the kind of stories people remember. The kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Thanks for watching. Thank you.